Independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has begun hearings to examine historical allegations of abuse in a children's home and residential school in Rochdale. The inquiry will investigate an alleged failure to prosecute the late MP Cyril Smith. In his opening statement, Brian Altman QC, counsel to the inquiry, said that the hearings were in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
The child abuse inquiry is planning to go back nearly 60 years and delve into the dark past of two children's homes, this one, Knowl View, and Cambridge House. The claims that children were abused, that staff knew, that no one was brought to justice, and that the scandal was covered up. The larger-than-life Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who died 7 years ago, was a governor of Knowl View.
Do you want a man to represent you, or do you want a party robot?
The claim is that he used his position to get access to children. The first allegations against him date back to 1961. Police investigated, but in 1970 prosecutors said the evidence was stale and his accusers not reliable. By the early 1990s, experts reported growing concerns children were being abused at the Knowl View home. Little action was taken. Last month, finally, Rochdale Council apologised for failing children. Today, the public inquiry will begin taking fresh evidence.
The reason that this matters is we cannot have a situation in this country where powerful people are able to abuse children and can get away with it because other powerful people are protecting them. That cannot be allowed to happen, and that's why we have to investigate what happened with Cyril Smith, and that's why we have to learn the lessons from it.
The inquiry takes evidence like a court but can't prosecute. Its job to discover what happened and who covered it up, and to find ways of preventing it happening again. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Let's speak now to our correspondent Sophie Long, who's at the inquiry. And Sophie, right at the outset, this issue of whether Cyril Smith was protected by others in power, this is right at the forefront of the inquiry.
Yes, Brian Altman is the counsel to the inquiry here. He is still making his opening statement, and he began by explaining that this is not an investigation into the actions of Cyril Smith, but they will of course be central to this. And he said that this investigation will be looking at those two institutions that you heard about in Tom Simons' report. And he began by setting out why this is important, because both those institutions now cease to exist, and many of the people who resided there have passed away, as have some of those accused of abuse. But he said that this is not a period of time that became consigned to history. One of those institutions was still admitting pupils until 1994. This is what he said about why this part of the investigation is taking place.
The decision to embark upon this investigation was in part in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment. It's only really because of Cyril Smith that the wider issue of child sexual abuse in Rochdale from the 1960s to the 1990s garnered attention. What the investigation was struck by, however, was the broader picture that emerged by shining a light on Cyril Smith. In other words, it illuminated the day-to-day experiences of children that would have gone unexamined.
So Brian Altman there, the counsel to the inquiry, setting out this part of the inquiry. He told people there that Rochdale affords the panel a rare opportunity to consider how local authorities responded to allegations of abuse of children at the hands of the politicians. He also said that he stressed how important it is for those whose lives have been blighted by these allegations so many years ago, how important it is for them to come here and give evidence. And that's what we will see over the coming 3 weeks. This part of the inquiry will take place over 3 weeks. The inquiry itself due to go on for some years, where it's not due to draw to a close until 2020.
Sophie, thank you. Correspondent Sophie Long there. And we can, in fact, cross to the inquiry, which is going on in the building behind Sophie, and hear the proceedings which are being provided to us on a slight delay.
Smith states most emphatically that he never behaved in an indecent way towards any of the boys. It's perhaps significant that he didn't avail himself of the opportunity provided to give specific answers to the allegations as they were put to him. Whilst in no way failing to appreciate his dilemma, he had nonetheless been previously supplied with a copy of the boys' complaints. Having regard to his reputation and his undoubted wide experience of affairs, he was most unimpressive during my interview with him. He had difficulty in articulating, and even the stock replies he proffered could only be obtained after repeated promptings from his solicitor. Were he ever to be placed in the witness box, he would be at the mercy of any competent counsel. And returning to the concern that the Lancashire investigation into Smith had in some way been impeded, it's important to note that Superintendent Leach was unsparing in his view that the allegations were truthful. At the foot of page 13, the page that we should be on,
Well, that is from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And if you want to continue watching proceedings, you can do so on the inquiry's website, which is streaming proceedings live with a slight delay.
In its first public hearings into historic allegations of abuse in Rochdale, the inquiry was told the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, was aware of the claims against the MP when she approved his knighthood. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
In the 1960s, they called him Mr. Rochdale. He became mayor of the town for Labour, but defected to the Liberals, the forerunners of today's Liberal Democrats.
Do you want a man to represent you, or do you want a party robot?
But in the 60s, it was never revealed that he'd been accused of sexually abusing deprived boys. After nearly 6 decades, what started as rumour and innuendo has led to this: 3 weeks of public hearings at the Child Abuse Inquiry to finally get to the bottom of it.
The decision to embark upon this investigation was in part in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment.
It's claimed Cyril Smith later abused boys at this school for troubled children, but in 1970 police were investigating allegations about him at a hostel for young men, Cambridge House, when he came to see them. A transcript of the meeting records a police officer saying,
"You want to see what we know?" And Smith started laughing at that. "Well, yes, fishing. I think that's fair comment."
Fishing because Cyril Smith was hoping to move from local politics to national. He told the police,
"In 3 weeks' time, I've got to give a decision, one way or another, whether I'm going to fight the next parliamentary election as a Liberal in Rochdale. And if I'm going to be charged, I'm not going to accept. Guilty or not guilty, it would be unfair to the party."
He wasn't charged. Years later, the press started to get wind of the investigation that had taken place, and now the inquiry's found new evidence of a cover-up.
This inquiry made a request to MI5, the security service, to see if it had any information that was relevant to this investigation.
It did. Secret files from MI5's archives suggest in 1979 prosecutors lied to journalists and denied Smith had been investigated.
Smith was re-elected in greater numbers than before, and far from diminishing him, the allegations appear to have had absolutely no effect whatsoever.
Cyril Smith will be at the centre of these 3 weeks of hearings, but the allegations are much wider, that paedophiles had easy access to children in Rochdale and that it was covered up.
Now, the Child Sex Abuse Inquiry has heard that prosecutors lied to the press in 1979 about the existence of serious allegations against the Liberal MP, Sir Cyril Smith. The inquiry heard that officers who had been investigating claims that he abused teenage boys in Rochdale had decided there was a case, but prosecutors decided not to take any action. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons has the details.
The inquiries obtained these documents held by the security service MI5, which record that the Director of Public Prosecution's press representative had untruthfully told Bartlett, a journalist, that they had no record of this case.
Smith was re-elected in greater numbers than before, and far from diminishing him, the allegations appear to have had absolutely no effect whatsoever.
Also under investigation, the rife sexual abuse linked to this residential school, Knowl View, where Smith was a governor. At one point, a sex offender roamed its corridors at night. But as with Cyril Smith, the central allegation is of a cover-up. This inquiry is attempting to learn the lessons of the past so that children can be better protected in future. Tom Simons, BBC News, at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.